Welcome to De Bello Gallico 6.1. Okay, let's start with the vocabulary note, because you gotta love that Caesar vocabulary. Iter itineris, neuter, is a noun, and it means route or path. Emphasize that it is neuter. Neuter rules, if you've forgotten, are the nominative and accusative are always the same. So the nominative is iter, and the accusative likewise is iter. And the second rule is the nominative and the accusative plural end in a. So the plural of iter is itinera in the nominative, and in the accusative, since we have this rule, they have to be the same, itinera is also neuter accusative plural. So I'm just mentioning this because it shows up a lot, and if you aren't paying attention, you might not know if they're talking about one route or more than one route. And since Caesar spends the entire chapter talking about this word, you should definitely keep an eye out for it. Okay, here is a nifty map that will really help you to understand this chapter. You also have a link to it in Canvas. It's from the Michigan War Studies Review, obviously. Okay, so over here, we have the Helvetian territory. And in this chapter, Caesar talks about the two ways the Helvetians have for leaving their land. This is Route 1, and this is Route 2. Route 1 is discussed in Chapter 6.1. Route 2 is in Chapter 6.2. It might be a little bit difficult to see this on the map, but we'll zoom in a little and see if we can give you some more perspective on here. Okay, so this is the Helvetian territory, and as you can see, this body of water is Lake Geneva, and over here are the Ural Mountains. Mountainy, it doesn't show up well here. So this is what he talks about in 6.1. That's Route 1, one way they can leave their tiny territory. The other way is to go this way, Route 2, and we'll talk about the description of that in just a second. Okay, here's another image that gives you a better idea of Route 1, the one that's discussed in Chapter 6.1. First of all, I don't know if this route that Caesar's talking about. All I did was Google Helvetians, Ural Mountains, and this is what came up. But we can take artistic license and pretend that you understand. So up here, we have Mons Jura. Down here, we have the river, and the Helvetian route would go between the river and the mountain, which is fine, I guess, as long as you're sure that there's nobody up here who's unfriendly, waiting to chuck things down on you. So the Helvetians could go this way if they wanted to. It's kind of narrow and skinny, and if you have bad guys up here who don't like you, it could be a problem, but it might work out. Apparently this pass, this road that Caesar talks about here, is really skinny and narrow. It's not that wide. So you could get caught if you had unfriendly guys up there, but if you got along with the people here, it might not be a problem. Oh, and since we're talking about that route in 6.1, we should probably talk about a little bit of grammar. Okay, you have learned what a result clause is, but we'll read where you have a degree word like so whatever, a degree word. For example, Mrs. Hahn was so happy, and then your result clause, the degree word is so, the result clause has an ut plus a subjunctive and talks about what happened as a result of the first part of the sentence. So, Mrs. Hahn was so happy that she canceled the final exam. That would be a result clause. So, in this passage, 6.1, Caesar introduces, notice there's a blank before the result clause, he introduces a sneaky result clause. And that's where the degree word is kind of understood but not explicitly stated. So, if you remember from the picture, we were talking about Mount Jura, and Caesar describes it as altissimus. And we were talking about superlatives last time around, so you probably look at altissimus and say, very high, or rather high, or the highest. But I call it a sneaky result clause because you could say the mountain was so very high, and then introduce your ut plus a subjunctive clause here. So very high that something resulted from it. So what we're saying is, inside the superlative adjective, you can have the understood notion of a degree word that would help to introduce a subsequent result clause. Not that it might have happened in 6.1 or anything like that. Okay, so in 6.1 and 6.2, we know that Caesar talks about the two different routes that they can take. They can take Route 1 or Route 2. Compare these routes. Now, last time we talked about comparative adjectives, and you're like, yeah, Mrs. Hahn, I know a comparative adjective always has e-or. So if one route is nicer than the other, you might use an e-or adjective, or bigger, or happier, richer. You'll always have an e-or, like die witty or he was richer than the other, or happier, lighty, or she was happier than the sad Latin students. And that's all well and good, except the word iter is a neuter noun, and neuter comparative adjectives don't follow the same rules. That would be way too easy. When you're comparing, using a neuter comparative adjective, you don't have an e-or. Instead, you have e-us. So, if you want to say one route is easier than the other, facil e-us. We have to use the neuter. We can't say facil e-or because iter is neuter, so facilior is only for masculine and feminine. So you have to say an easier route, facilius iter. Or if you want to say one route is less blocked, you, instead of saying expeditior, easier to travel, instead you'd have to use the neuter comparative adjective, and that eor becomes expeditius. So watch out, these are comparative adjectives that modify the word iter, and they're neuter, which is why they don't have the IOR that you just barely remembered. And one final note for chapter 6.3. It's actually pretty easy. It just talks about that second route that Caesar discusses that they could go through, do with that super high mountain. The second route doesn't. And Caesar gives us very plain language. I think you can understand it, but I want you to make sure that you pay attention to the description there. And he talks about that city, Geneva. Make sure you pay attention to what Caesar said about whose territory it's in, because the entire thing is about the migration of the Helvetians from one place to another, and they're traveling through lands that are controlled by various different tribes. So we need to know whose territory the Helvetians are in at any given time.